Richard Harmon checked his watch for the fifth time in 10 minutes. Tonight was the night. The luxury restaurant around him buzzed with quiet conversations and the gentle clink of expensive silverware. At 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that cost more than some cars, Richard looked every bit the successful tech billionaire he was. Across from him sat Elizabeth, his wife of 20 years. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes that had once looked at him with complete adoration. Now they held something else. Worry perhaps, or maybe it was just tiredness after standing by him through his climb from struggling programmer to the owner of Harmon Tech, now worth billions. "You've been distant lately," Elizabeth said, breaking the uncomfortable silence between them. "Is everything okay at work?" Richard cleared his throat. Work was more than okay. Harmon Tech's stock had doubled in the last quarter, but that wasn't what had been keeping him away from home until late hours. "Liz, we need to talk," he said, the words feeling rehearsed because they were. He'd practiced this speech in his office mirror countless times. "I think we both know things haven't been right between us for a while." Elizabeth's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Richard reached for his wine glass, needing something to hold. "I think we've grown apart. We want different things now." "Different things." Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. "Richard, we've been planning our trip to Italy for months. Last week you were talking about maybe finally starting a family." Richard looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The truth was, he had already started planning a different future, one that didn't include Elizabeth. "There's someone else," he finally said. The restaurant continued its elegant hum around them, oblivious to the way Elizabeth's world had just shattered. She sat perfectly still, as if movement might break her completely. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Vanessa, my assistant." Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. "She's what, 28? 29, Richard corrected automatically, then winced at his own stupidity. "How long?" 6 months. Another truth that felt like a knife he was wielding himself. What Richard didn't know, what Elizabeth had planned to tell him tonight, was that after years of trying, she was finally pregnant. The doctor had confirmed it just yesterday. But now, looking at the stranger across from her, she pressed her hand against her stomach and made a silent promise to her unborn child. The next few weeks passed in a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and tabloid headlines. "Tess H. Titan Trides INAFO Niduio Modal," screamed one particularly nasty cover. Richard moved out of their home and into a downtown penthouse. Vanessa was photographed on his arm at galas and restaurants, her youth and beauty making Elizabeth's absence seem like an upgrade in Richard's life. Elizabeth disappeared from public view entirely. Friends tried to reach out, but she changed her number and rarely left home. What no one knew was that she wasn't just nursing a broken heart, she was preparing for a challenge far greater than a divorce. At her 12-week checkup, the doctor had news that nearly made Elizabeth faint. "Ms. Harmon, I'm seeing 4 distinct heartbeats," the doctor said, moving the ultrasound wand carefully. "Congratulations, you're expecting quadruplets." Elizabeth lay there, tears streaming down her face, unsure if they were from joy, fear, or the irony of the situation. For years, Richard had dragged his feet about starting a family, claiming one child would be challenging enough with their busy lives. Now she was facing the prospect of raising 4 babies alone. As she left the doctor's office, Elizabeth made a decision. Richard had chosen his path, and it led away from her. He'd never shown real enthusiasm about being a father. Why burden these innocent lives with a reluctant parent who'd already demonstrated how easily he could walk away? No, she would protect them from that kind of rejection. The babies, had babies, would never know the father who hadn't wanted them enough to stay. 6 months after the divorce papers were signed, Elizabeth sat in her hospital room, exhausted but filled with a joy she had never known before. 4 tiny cribs surrounded her bed, each holding a miracle that had come into the world just 18 hours ago. "You did amazing," said her sister Grace, who hadn't left her side since Elizabeth went into labor. "They're absolutely perfect." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes moving from one sleeping baby to the next. 3 girls and 1 boy. Her children, her family. Have you decided on their names? Grace asked, gently rocking the smallest of the four, a little girl with a dusting of dark hair just like Elizabeth's. Maya, Sophie, Lily, and Nathan, Elizabeth said, the names she'd chosen months ago rolling off her tongue. Each child already showed hints of personality. Maya, the fighter who'd been born first. Sophie, the calm observer. Lily, the tiny one with a powerful set of lungs. And Nathan, the only boy, who seemed to watch everything with curious eyes. None of them looked much like Richard, Elizabeth thought with a mixture of relief and sadness. Maybe that would change as they grew, but for now, they were just hers. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Harmon smiled for cameras as Vanessa showed off her massive diamond engagement ring. The ceremony was planned for next month, a lavish affair at a coastal resort with hundreds of guests and a feature spread in a popular magazine. Richard and I couldn't be happier, Vanessa told reporters, leaning into his side. We're planning to travel the world for our honeymoon, maybe Bali first, then Paris. Richard nodded along, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Sometimes, in quiet moments when Vanessa was busy planning wedding details or shopping with his credit cards, he thought about Elizabeth. He'd heard nothing from her since the divorce. No angry calls, no public statements, nothing. It was as if she vanished. The truth was, Elizabeth had no time for anger or revenge. Her days and nights bled together in a constant cycle of feedings, diaper changes, and brief naps whenever all four babies miraculously slept at once. She'd moved to a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood purchased with her divorce settlement. The home had a large yard and enough bedrooms for everyone. Elizabeth had hired 2 nannies to help. She couldn't possibly manage quadruplets alone, but she remained hands-on, determined to be there for every important moment. I don't know how you do it, Grace said one afternoon, watching Elizabeth feed Lily while keeping an eye on the others in their play area. Elizabeth smiled tiredly. One day at a time. They're worth every sleepless night. And they were. Each smile, each tiny hand grabbing her finger, each milestone, first smiles, first laughs, filled a part of her heart that had been broken after Richard's betrayal. She kept her promise too. Richard's name wasn't on the birth certificates. As far as the world knew, these 4 children had no father. 2 years passed this way. Richard's marriage to Vanessa made headlines, then faded from the news. Elizabeth's children grew from helpless newborns to toddlers with distinct personalities and boundless energy. One sunny morning, Elizabeth took the children to a neighborhood park. While they played in the sandbox under Grace's watchful eye, Elizabeth sat on a bench and opened a business magazine she brought along. Richard's face stared back at her from the cover. Tech Titan Expands Empire, read the headline. The article praised his business success, but noted trouble in his personal life. Rumors of Vanessa's excessive spending and possible infidelity filled the gossip columns. Elizabeth closed the magazine, feeling no satisfaction at his apparent unhappiness. That part of her life was over. Looking at her children playing together, Maya already the leader, organizing a game, Sophie carefully building a sandcastle, Lily chattering to herself, Nathan watching a butterfly with wonder, she knew she had made the right choice. These 4 little people were her world now. And Richard Harmon would never know what he was missing. 15 years passed in the blink of an eye. Elizabeth stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the controlled chaos that came with raising 4 teenagers. At 45, she had a few more lines around her eyes and streaks of silver in her dark hair, but she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had overcome tremendous challenges. Mom, have you seen my science project notes? Nathan called from upstairs. Now 15, he had grown into a tall, thoughtful boy with a passion for robotics and engineering that sometimes kept him up until the early hours of the morning. Check the dining room table, Elizabeth replied, packing lunches for all 4 kids. And hurry up or you'll miss the bus. Maya rushed into the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 15, she was already showing signs of the natural leader she would become, captain of the debate team, class president, and fiercely protective of her siblings. I found an amazing scholarship opportunity, she announced, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. It's for the Science and Tech program at Westlake University. Full ride, plus a research stipend. Elizabeth looked up with interest. That sounds perfect for you. What's the application process? That's the thing, Maya said, her eyes bright with excitement. It would work for all of us. They have tracks in different disciplines: science, business, arts, even sports medicine for Sophie. Sophie, the quietest of the quadruplets, entered the kitchen next. Where Maya was bold, Sophie was thoughtful, observing everything with wise eyes that seemed older than her 15 years. Her passion for understanding how the human body worked had led her toward medicine. What would work for me? She asked, catching the end of the conversation. A scholarship at Westlake, Maya explained. We should all apply. Lily bounced in last, energy radiating from her as always. The smallest of the quadruplets had grown into a creative force, her room filled with paintings and her mind constantly buzzing with stories and songs. I just finished my painting for art class, she announced. Mrs. Chen says it might win the district competition. Elizabeth smiled at her children, pride swelling in her chest. They had grown into remarkable young people, each with their own strengths and dreams. She had done this, raised them well, given them stability and love, all on her own. Well, not entirely on her own. There had been Grace and friends who became like family, and a community that embraced them. But there had never been Richard. Across the city, in a sleek downtown penthouse, Richard Harmon stared out at the skyline he had helped shape. At 60, his hair had turned completely gray, and the lines on his face had deepened. The last 15 years had brought tremendous business success and personal failure. His marriage to Vanessa had lasted barely 7 years before ending in a bitter public divorce that cost him half his fortune. She had been unfaithful, ironic considering how their relationship began, and greedy, fighting for every penny she could get. Richard poured himself a cup of coffee and opened his laptop. The board meeting later would be tense. Several members were pushing back on his latest acquisition plan. Once he had enjoyed these battles. Now they just left him feeling empty. His assistant had left several messages about a new scholarship program he was funding at Westlake University. The Board of Trustees wanted him to be personally involved in selecting recipients and attending the scholarship gala. Richard sighed. Public appearances were necessary to rebuild his image after the divorce scandal, but he found little joy in them. The scholarship had been his idea, a way to discover and nurture young talent in technology and other fields. Harmon Tech needed fresh minds, innovative thinkers. And perhaps, though he rarely admitted it even to himself, it was a way to leave something meaningful behind. Richard had no children, no family beyond distant cousins who only called when they needed money. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings alone in his penthouse, he wondered what might have happened if he had stayed with Elizabeth. Would they have had children? Would he have been a good father? These thoughts usually ended with another glass of scotch and work, until exhaustion took over. But tonight, staring at the scholarship applications his assistant had forwarded, something caught his eye. 4 applicants with the same last name, Harmon. Must be a coincidence, he thought, and turned to other matters. Many people had his last name. It meant nothing. He couldn't have known how wrong he was. The grand ballroom of the Westlake University Alumni Center glittered with crystal chandeliers and the flash of expensive jewelry. Richard Harmon stood near the entrance, shaking hands with university officials and nodding at appropriate moments. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, but his smile felt stiff after an hour of pleasantries. Mr. Harmon, we're so grateful for your generosity, said Dean Patterson, a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes. The Harmon Scholarship will change lives. That's the intention, Richard replied, checking his watch discreetly. These events always dragged on too long. When will the scholarship recipients arrive? They should be here any minute, the dean said. 15 exceptional young people, including a rather remarkable set of quadruplets. All 4 of them qualified independently, quite extraordinary. Richard's interest perked up slightly. Quadruplets? That is unusual. Before the dean could respond, a small commotion at the entrance caught their attention. A woman with dark hair touched with silver walked in, surrounded by 4 teenagers who were obviously her children. Even from across the room, Richard could see the family resemblance between them. Ah, there they are now, the dean said, waving the family over. Elizabeth. Over here. Richard froze. Elizabeth. It couldn't be. But it was. His ex-wife approached, looking more beautiful than he remembered. 15 years had been kind to her. She walked with confidence, her simple navy dress elegant without trying too hard. Then Richard's eyes moved to the 4 young people beside her, and his heart nearly stopped. Elizabeth Harmon and her children, Maya, Sophie, Lily, and Nathan, the dean introduced proudly. Our only quadruplet scholarship recipients in program history. Elizabeth's smile vanished when she saw Richard. The color drained from her face so quickly that Sophie, ever observant, put a steadying hand on her mother's arm. "Mom? Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "Mr. Harmon is funding the scholarship program," the dean continued, oblivious to the tension crackling between the former spouses. Richard couldn't speak. He was staring at the teenagers, 15 years old, his mind calculated automatically. Their faces held hints of Elizabeth, yes, but also himself. Maya had his determined chin. Nathan had the same shape of eyes. Lily's smile was achingly familiar, like looking at his sister in old family photos. And Sophie studied him with the same analytical gaze he used in board meetings. "It's been a long time, Richard," Elizabeth finally said, her voice steady despite her pale face. The teenagers exchanged confused glances. They had never heard their mother mention anyone named Richard. "You know Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Harmon?" the dean asked, looking back and forth between them. A painful silence hung in the air before Elizabeth answered. "We were acquainted many years ago." Richard found his voice at last. "Yes, a lifetime ago, it seems." His eyes never left the 4 teenagers. "Congratulations on your scholarships. You must be very proud, Elizabeth." "I am," she said simply. Maya, always protective, stepped slightly in front of her mother. "Thank you for the scholarship, Mr. Harmon," she said formally, extending her hand. "Your investment in education is commendable." Richard shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip, just like his own. "I look forward to hearing about your academic goals," he managed to say. The dean, sensing something unspoken, smoothly suggested they all move toward the dining area where the ceremony would begin shortly. As the crowd shifted, Richard caught Elizabeth's elbow gently. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, urgently, "we need to talk." Her eyes met his, filled with emotions he couldn't fully read: fear, defiance, regret. "Yes," she agreed finally. "We do." Across the room, the quadruplets had found their assigned table. Nathan leaned toward his sisters. "Is it just me," he whispered, "or does that Harmon guy look kind of familiar?" Lily shrugged. "Maybe he's been in business magazines. Mom used to read those." But Sophie was staring thoughtfully at her mother and the billionaire, her quick mind making connections. "His last name is Harmon," she said slowly, "just like ours." Maya followed her sister's gaze, her eyes narrowing as she watched their mother's tense conversation with the scholarship donor. "That's weird," she admitted. None of them realized that their world was about to change forever. The scholarship dinner dragged on for what felt like hours to Elizabeth. She barely touched her food, her stomach in knots as she watched Richard from across the room. He kept glancing at her children, his expression a mix of wonder and disbelief. She knew what would come next, and there was no avoiding it. When the formal program ended, Elizabeth found a quiet corner of the garden outside the ballroom. The cool night air was a relief after the stuffiness inside. She texted her children to meet her there in 20 minutes, then waited for Richard. He didn't take long to find her. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Those children, they're mine, aren't they?" She looked at him directly, the man she had once loved more than anything. "Yes." Richard sank onto a stone bench, looking suddenly older than his 60 years. "Quadruplets. All this time, you never told me." "You left me for your 28-year-old assistant," Elizabeth said, her voice steady but not unkind. "You made it very clear what you wanted, and it wasn't a family with me." "I had a right to know," Richard insisted, running a hand through his gray hair. 15 years, Elizabeth. 15 years I could have been in their lives." "And would you have been, really?" Elizabeth asked. "You were building your empire with Vanessa. When exactly would you have made time for 4 babies?" Richard had no answer. The truth was, he probably wouldn't have. Back then, children hadn't been part of his plan. But now, seeing those 4 remarkable young people who carried his blood. "They don't know about me," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. I never told them. Inside the ballroom, Maya had gathered her siblings after noticing their mother's absence. Something weird is happening, she told them. Mom looks like she's seen a ghost ever since she met that Harmon guy. I searched him on my phone, Sophie said, showing them her screen. Richard Harmon, tech billionaire, founder of Harmon Tech. And look at this. She scrolled down to an old article with a headline, Tech CEO Richard Harmon divorces wife of 20 years. Wait, Nathan said, taking the phone. Is that Mom? They stared at the small photo of a younger Elizabeth alongside Richard Harmon. Mom was married to him. Lily whispered, her artistic eye quickly noting the similarities between the man in the photo and Nathan's jawline, Maya's determined expression. We need to talk to her, Maya decided, checking her phone. She wants us to meet her in the garden in 5 minutes. As they made their way through the crowd, snippets of conversation reached them. Those must be the Harmon quadruplets everyone's talking about. Same last name as the donor, coincidence. They look just like him around the eyes, don't they? The pieces were falling into place with each step they took. Outside in the garden, Richard and Elizabeth fell silent as the 4 teenagers approached. The moment of truth had arrived. Mom, Maya said, her voice unusually hesitant. We need to ask you something. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I know what you're going to ask. And yes, it's true. She gestured to Richard. This is Richard Harmon. We were married for 20 years before we divorced. He's your father. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Nathan stared at Richard with wide eyes. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. Sophie's analytical gaze moved between her mother and this stranger who was apparently their father. Maya found her voice first. Why didn't you tell us? She demanded, hurt and confusion babbling in her expression. I thought it was best, Elizabeth said softly. He chose to leave before you were born. I never wanted you to feel abandoned. I didn't know, Richard said, addressing his children directly for the first time. I had no idea your mother was pregnant when we divorced. If I had known. What? Maya challenged. What would you have done? Stayed with Mom out of obligation? Part-time visits on weekends? Richard flinched at her tone but couldn't deny the truth in her words. You weren't ready to be a father then, Elizabeth said quietly. I made the decision I thought was right at the time. Sophie, always the peacemaker, placed a gentle hand on her mother's shoulder. We should all talk about this somewhere more private, she suggested, ever practical. Nathan hadn't taken his eyes off Richard. You're really our father? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Richard nodded, emotion making it hard to speak. I am. All this time, Lily whispered. We had a father and didn't even know. The night breeze rustled through the garden as 5 lives forever changed in ways none of them could have imagined when the evening began. 2 weeks after the scholarship gala, Richard sat nervously in Elizabeth's living room. The house was warm and lived in, photos covering the walls, well-worn furniture, a piano in the corner covered with sheet music that must be Lily's. It was nothing like his sleek, cold penthouse. Would you like some coffee? Elizabeth asked, her tone polite but distant. Please, Richard said, looking around at the life she had built without him. In the kitchen, she could hear the quadruplets upstairs, arguing about something in the way siblings do. They'd agreed to meet Richard today, though their reactions to the news about their father still varied wildly. When Elizabeth returned with the coffee, Richard accepted it gratefully. Thank you for allowing this, he said quietly. I know you had no obligation to let me into their lives now. Elizabeth sat across from him. It wasn't entirely my decision. They're old enough to make up their own minds about whether they want to know you. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the first teenager. It was Nathan, dressed neatly in jeans and a button-down shirt, his hair combed more carefully than usual. He'd been the most openly curious about meeting Richard again. Hello, he said somewhat awkwardly, sitting on the couch. Hello, Nathan, Richard replied, fighting the urge to stare at the boy who so clearly had his grandfather's eyes. Thank you for agreeing to talk with me. Sophie came next, quiet and observant as always. She took a seat beside her brother, offering Richard a small, cautious smile. I brought some old photos, Richard said, reaching for a folder he placed on the coffee table. My parents, your grandparents. and some of me when I was younger. I thought you might want to see them." Sophie reached for the folder. "I'd like that," she said softly. Lily appeared in the doorway next, hovering uncertainly until Elizabeth patted the spot next to her. The artistic girl sat close to her mother, but her curious eyes kept darting to Richard. Of Maya, there was no sign. "Maya's not coming down," Lily finally explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's still angry." Richard nodded, trying to hide his disappointment. "I understand. She has every right to be." "She said to start without her," Sophie added, already looking through the photos with Nathan. For the next hour, Richard answered their questions as honestly as he could. No, he hadn't known about Elizabeth's pregnancy. Yes, he regretted the way he had ended their marriage. No, he couldn't go back and change the past. "What was Mom like when you met her?" Lily asked, warming up enough to join the conversation. Richard's face softened at the memory. She was the smartest person in every room, but never made anyone feel small because of it. She had this laugh that could make anyone smile, even on their worst day. Elizabeth looked away, surprised by the fondness in his voice. "And what about you?" Nathan asked. "Mom never told us anything about you." "I built computers in my parents' garage as a teenager," Richard said. "I was always taking things apart to see how they worked. Drove my mother crazy." Nathan's eyes widened. "I did that too. I rebuilt my laptop last summer." A noise from the stairs drew everyone's attention. Maya stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene. "Decided to join us after all?" Elizabeth asked gently. Maya walked into the room but remained standing. "I had questions too," she admitted reluctantly. She fixed Richard with a stern look. "Why should we trust you now? How do we know you won't disappear again when things get difficult?" The room fell silent. It was the question beneath all their caution, their hesitancy. Richard met her gaze directly. "That's fair," he said. "I don't have a perfect answer. I can only show you, day by day, that I'm serious about being in your lives if you'll let me. I'm not the same man who left your mother. I've learned, the hard way, what really matters." "Words are easy," Maya challenged. "You're right," Richard agreed, "which is why I'm asking for a chance to prove it with actions instead." Elizabeth watched the exchange, seeing her own strength reflected in her daughter. She had raised them to question, to demand better from the people in their lives. "I have an idea," Sophie said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. "We each decide individually what kind of relationship we want with Richard. No pressure either way." Maya's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That seems fair." "I'd like to learn more about Harmon-Tech," Nathan ventured. "Maybe see where you work sometime." "I'd be honored to show you," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. In that moment, looking at these four remarkable young people who shared his blood but had been shaped entirely by Elizabeth's love, Richard knew with absolute certainty that he had missed something more valuable than all his billions. But perhaps it wasn't too late to build something new. 1 year later, Elizabeth's backyard was filled with people celebrating the quadruplets' 16th birthday. Tables decorated with colorful balloons dotted the lawn, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. Elizabeth watched from the patio as her children moved through the crowd of friends and family. Nathan stood with Richard near the grill, the two of them deep in conversation about the internship Nathan would start at Harmon-Tech next summer. Over the past year, they had bonded over their shared love of technology. Richard had been careful not to push too hard, letting the relationship develop naturally. Sophie sat with her Aunt Grace, showing her the acceptance letter from a prestigious pre-med summer program that Richard had helped her find. Of all the quadruplets, Sophie had been the most accepting, her analytical mind able to see past old hurts to the possibilities of the future. Lily bounced between groups, her camera in hand as she documented the day. Richard had surprised her with professional photography equipment for Christmas after learning about her passion for visual arts. Though initially hesitant to accept the gift, Lily had eventually been won over by Richard's genuine interest in her creative projects. Only Maya remained distant, though even she had softened somewhat. Elizabeth spotted her by the dessert table, arranging cupcakes with her friends. Richard had attended every one of her debate tournaments, sitting quietly in the back, asking for nothing in return. His consistent presence had begun to chip away at her walls, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Elizabeth herself had found an unexpected peace with her ex-husband's return to their lives. The anger she had carried for so many years had gradually faded as she watched him try, with humble determination, to earn a place in their children's world. "Quite a party," Richard said, joining her on the patio with 2 glasses of lemonade. He handed one to her. "They seem happy." Elizabeth nodded. "They are. It's been a good year, despite all the complications." Richard looked out at the yard full of people who loved his children, people who had been there all the years he hadn't. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for raising them to be such incredible people. You did that, Elizabeth, all on your own." "Not entirely on my own," she admitted. "I had help. Grace, friends, neighbors." She paused. "But yes, I'm proud of who they've become." A commotion at the center of the yard caught their attention. The quadruplets were gathering near the large birthday cake, candles already lit. Nathan waved at Richard. "Dad, come on, we're cutting the cake." It was the first time any of them had called him Dad instead of Richard. The simple word hit him like a physical force. Elizabeth saw the emotion on his face and touched his arm gently. "You'd better go," she said with a small smile. "They're waiting." As Richard joined the teenagers, Maya surprised everyone by shifting slightly to make room for him in their circle. It wasn't a hug or even a smile, but it was an acknowledgement, a tiny crack in the wall she had built. "Make a wish," someone called as the quadruplets prepared to blow out their candles. In that moment, surrounded by his children for the first time at a family celebration, Richard felt a happiness deeper than anything his billions had ever bought him. He had missed 15 years, yes, but rather than dwelling on what was lost, he had spent the past year focusing on what could still be built. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Elizabeth found Richard helping to clean up, gathering paper plates and cups like any other parent might. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "the kids have been talking about a trip to the lake this summer. The cabin only has 4 bedrooms, but the couch pulls out." Richard looked at her, surprised by the implicit invitation. "I'd like that," he said simply. From across the yard, Maya watched them talking. She still had her doubts, her questions, her anger sometimes. But seeing her mother smile more this past year, watching her siblings discover parts of themselves in this man who was their father, it was harder to hold on to the bitterness. When Richard glanced her way, Maya did something she had refused to do all year. She walked over to him. "Thank you for coming today," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. It meant a lot to them. A pause. "To all of us." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. As the summer sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, the unlikely family continued cleaning up together. 6 people connected by blood and choice, by past mistakes and future possibilities, by the slow, imperfect work of building something new from what had been broken.